In a bustling airport, amid the steady flow of passengers, the tension was palpable. Just as he approached the boarding gate, a man found himself face to face with someone who would quickly turn his day into an ordeal of humiliation and disrespect. He was simply ready to board, but that's when he felt the sharp sting of hostility aimed directly at him. A police officer, standing tall and stern, blocked his path, his glare icy and unwavering. "Excuse me, sir, do you mind stepping aside for a moment?" The officer's voice was clipped, as if each word carried a blade. There was no "please," no professional courtesy, just an immediate presumption of suspicion. The man, dressed in civilian clothes with only a subtle airline badge as an identifier, glanced around, confused. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady, yet he could feel the unease creeping in. The officer didn't respond directly, choosing instead to scan him with a look of disdain. "What exactly is it that you're doing here?" the officer demanded, louder now, attracting the attention of nearby passengers. "This isn't your boarding group. Do you even have a ticket?" The man's brows furrowed as he felt eyes turning toward him, whispers starting to circulate. He reached for his ID, trying to clarify, to put an end to the officer's growing assumptions. But as he lifted his hand, the officer snapped, "Hands where I can see them. Now." A few passengers gasped, and the man froze, his heart pounding with both frustration and fear. His ID remained tucked in his pocket as he felt the weight of the stairs around him. Each passing second felt heavier than the last as he struggled to find the words, the explanation that would spare him further scrutiny. But the officer pressed on, his tone brimming with accusation. "I'm asking you a question," the officer insisted, his gaze hardening. "You need to tell me why you're lingering around here, bothering the boarding process." "I'm not bothering anyone," the man replied, his voice low but steady. "I'm supposed to be here." He gestured subtly towards the aircraft, hoping the officer would understand the implication. But his explanation only seemed to fuel the officer's disdain. "Oh, is that right?" The officer scoffed, folding his arms. "You think just because you're wearing that little badge, you have some right to be here? Let me guess, you're trying to sneak into first class, aren't you? This isn't where you belong. People like you, people like me." The man cut in, his tone now edged with an unyielding calm. He could feel a storm brewing inside him, a mix of anger and the deep ache of humiliation, but he fought to keep it under control. "Sir, you're mistaken. I have every right to be here." The officer shook his head, the smirk on his face widening as he gestured to the small badge pinned on the man's jacket. "This little plastic badge doesn't mean anything to me. I'm tired of people like you pretending to have access to places you don't. Now, I'm giving you one last chance, step aside before I have to call for backup." Passengers whispered among themselves, some glancing over with pity, others with curiosity, but most seemed to believe the officer's side of the story. No one questioned his authority or the way he wielded it. To them, he was a symbol of order and safety, and they accepted his words without a second thought. Trying one last time to defuse the tension, the man took a deep breath. "Sir, please, just let me show you my ID. I work here." The officer's laugh was derisive, his voice mocking. "Oh, you work here now? As what, a janitor? Maintenance? Because whatever it is, you're way out of line if you think you're about to board this plane before paying passengers. I know your type, always looking for a way in where you're not wanted." That was the breaking point. The words, dripping with contempt, the assumptions, each more degrading than the last, all of it sank deep, each insult layering upon the last until it felt like a weight on his chest. He could feel his grip slipping on the calm he tried so hard to maintain, but he reminded himself of where he was, of the eyes on him, and of the responsibility he carried. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "If you just take a moment to listen," he said quietly, "I think you'll realize that you're mistaken." But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but every word clear as crystal. "I'm done listening to you. Either you step aside, or I'll make you. This is my airport, and here, people like you follow my rules. A nerve struck. The man's jaw clenched as he held the officer's stare, his anger finally starting to seep through. He could feel the crowd watching, their assumptions solidifying with each passing second. They saw a confrontation, one in which they assumed he was the one in the wrong. His character, his professionalism, his very identity, all questioned in a single encounter by someone who knew nothing about him but had judged him in a heartbeat. "Fine," he said, voice low and resolute. "I'll wait. But soon, you're going to understand exactly where I belong here." With that, he took a step back, not out of submission, but to let the scene play out. The officer smirked, clearly taking it as a victory, his stance triumphant as he turned back to the crowd, as if expecting applause for his heroic intervention. Little did he know that in a few short minutes, everything would change. Because the man he'd just humiliated, the man he'd treated like an intruder, was, in fact, the one who would be guiding them all safely through the skies. The true power dynamics were about to shift in a way the officer could never have anticipated. As the boarding process continued and passengers shuffled onto the plane, a quiet anticipation filled the air. Some glanced back at the officer, others whispered among themselves, replaying the confrontation in their minds, wondering who was right and who was wrong. But when the announcement finally echoed over the intercom, and the officer was summoned to the cockpit to address an issue, he would soon find himself face to face once again with the man he dismissed. Only this time, there would be no smirk, no mockery, only shock as he came to understand the true authority of the man he had tried to undermine. What would happen when they finally met again, but this time with the tables turned? And how would the passengers, now seated and observing the unfolding scene, react to the revelation that their captain, the very person responsible for their lives in the air, had been the target of such baseless scorn? Stay tuned to discover how the tables turn, as this officer finds himself in a situation he could never have prepared for, a reckoning that no badge, no authority, and no prejudice could shield him from. Because in the end, respect isn't given by title or appearance, but by character. And today, he's about to learn just how wrong he was about the man he tried to bring down. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in equality, respect, and creating stories that shed light on injustice while inspiring change. To every Black viewer watching, know that you are valued, seen, and supported here. Our stories honor resilience and the pursuit of justice, and we hope today's narrative resonates with you. Enjoy the story, and if you find our content meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more impactful tales. Thank you for being here. As Marcus Carter walked into the bustling terminal of Logan International Airport, he could already feel the weight of his responsibilities settling onto his shoulders. There was a precision and control he needed to maintain, especially today. Marcus was not only a pilot, he was a senior captain who'd earned his stripes through years of dedication, discipline, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. This was the life he'd worked so hard for, the life he'd fought for, despite the obstacles he'd encountered. Marcus had been flying for nearly 2 decades. From small commercial planes to massive airliners, he had accumulated thousands of hours in the air. His colleagues admired him, his passengers respected him, and his family looked up to him. But for Marcus, this role went beyond a career. It was a testament to his resilience. As a Black man in an industry where he often felt isolated, Marcus had to be exceptional to gain even a fraction of the respect his white counterparts received effortlessly. It wasn't just about flying a plane, it was about showing others that he belonged there, despite what some might assume at a glance. As he moved through the terminal, clad in civilian clothes with his airline badge neatly clipped to his jacket, Marcus was aware that he looked like any other passenger. This anonymity was comforting. He enjoyed being another face in the crowd before slipping into his uniform and taking command of the cockpit. Today's flight was a routine one to Los Angeles. He would meet his co-pilot, go through the pre-flight checklist, and then guide his passengers across the country with the steady confidence they depended on. But Marcus wasn't the only one moving through the airport with a sense of purpose. Derek Thompson, a local police officer and part-time airport security officer, was stationed at Logan that day. Derek was known among his peers for his strict, often unyielding, approach to security. He had been a cop for over 10 years, and he took his job seriously, sometimes too seriously. He believed that his sharp eye and intuition were his best assets, and they often served him well. But his instincts were clouded by deep-seated biases, though he'd never acknowledge it openly. He thought of himself as someone who treated everyone equally, but his assumptions often led him to scrutinize individuals based on appearances rather than actual behavior. Derek's personal life had its share of complications. Recently divorced and with 2 teenage kids he rarely saw, his frustrations often spilled over into his work. Policing gave him a sense of control, a feeling of authority he no longer had in his personal life. Today, he was particularly on edge, scanning faces, looking for anyone who might fit his idea of suspicious. When he saw Marcus moving purposefully through the terminal, dressed in casual attire with a small badge on his jacket, his attention zeroed in on him. To Derek, Marcus looked out of place, too confident, too sure of himself, as though he owned the place. It was a small detail, but to Derek, it was a red flag. As Marcus approached the boarding area, Derek stepped forward, his expression stern and uninviting. "Sir," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made nearby passengers turn their heads. Marcus stopped, surprised, but kept his composure. "Yes." Marcus responded politely, a slight smile on his face, despite the abruptness of the officer's tone. "Can I see your boarding pass and ID?" Derek demanded. His tone was not one of routine procedure, but rather of suspicion, as though Marcus had somehow disrupted the order of the day just by walking through the terminal. Marcus handed over his ID and badge without hesitation, hoping to avoid a scene. But as he did, he could feel the familiar knot of frustration tightening in his stomach. He'd been through enough experiences like this to know where it was headed. "Where are you headed today?" Derek asked, looking down at the ID and badge with a frown, scrutinizing them as if they might reveal something untoward. "I'm actually part of the crew," Marcus explained calmly, nodding toward the gate. "I'm the captain for this flight." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips curling into a faint, disbelieving smirk. "The captain?" he echoed, his tone laced with disbelief. To him, Marcus's claim seemed almost laughable. Marcus met Derek's gaze, holding steady, refusing to let the man's incredulous tone rattle him. "Yes, that's correct," he replied, his voice even and steady, though he could feel his patience being tested. Moments like these were all too common, reminders that no matter how high he climbed, he'd always encounter those who questioned his right to be there. Derek scanned him once more, his expression unreadable but his body language hostile. "I'm gonna need you to step aside for a more thorough check," he announced, his tone cold and impersonal. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew he could demand to speak to Derek's supervisor, or insist on calling his airline, but that would only escalate the situation. And while he felt the simmering anger and frustration, he also knew that any reaction on his part could easily be misinterpreted. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his voice controlled, though he could feel the weight of nearby passengers' stares on him. He'd always hated public scenes, especially when he became the focus of them. "Problem is, you're not following the proper procedures," Derek replied, his words clipped. "You can't just wander around like you own the place." "I'm following every procedure necessary," Marcus countered, keeping his tone polite but firm. "I've been through security. I have my credentials right here." Derek leaned in, lowering his voice but not his hostility. "I don't care what credentials you think you have. I'm not letting you near that plane without a full search." The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills. Marcus knew that Derek wasn't interested in his credentials, or in anything he had to say. This was about control, about power, about someone needing to feel superior in a situation they could not understand or accept. Fine, Marcus said finally, his tone resigned. He stepped aside, allowing Derek to conduct his search, feeling the shame of being publicly scrutinized seep into his bones. He could sense the other passengers watching, their judgment silent but present, 100 small glances that each carried a weight he was all too familiar with. As Derek conducted his search, his hands moved methodically, almost relishing each moment of his control over Marcus. And as Marcus stood there, enduring the unnecessary pat-down, he focused on steadying his breath, on keeping his composure. He was no stranger to moments like these, but the indignity still cut deep. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Derek stepped back, his expression one of smug satisfaction. "You're clear," he said, his tone dismissive, as though he were doing Marcus a favor by allowing him to proceed. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, his frustration and anger simmering just beneath the surface. Marcus collected himself, straightening his jacket and adjusting his badge. He could feel the stares of the other passengers lingering on him, as though they were watching some sort of spectacle. He met their gazes evenly, silently daring anyone to say something, to challenge him, to defend him. But no one did. They turned away, pretending not to have seen what had just transpired. With a final breath to steady himself, Marcus proceeded to the boarding gate, his mind replaying the encounter with Derek over and over. It was an old wound, a familiar ache, one he knew too well. But he reminded himself why he was here, why he'd chosen this path. He had worked too hard to let someone's narrow-minded assumptions shake him. In the cockpit, Marcus found comfort in the familiar surroundings, the controls, the dials, the hum of the engines preparing for takeoff. Here, he was in his element, a place where he was respected, where his authority was unquestionable. But the residue of Derek's words lingered, a reminder of the world outside this cockpit, a world that still questioned his right to be here. As he prepared for the flight, he knew this wasn't the end of the encounter. He felt the pull of a deeper reckoning, an unspoken promise that the tables would soon turn. For now, though, he would fly, his focus unwavering, his determination unshaken. But the seeds of change had been planted, and Derek Thompson was about to learn that respect isn't given by uniforms, badges, or appearances, it's earned. The passengers settled into their seats, the hum of conversations blending with the soft announcements echoing through the cabin. Marcus Carter, now dressed in his uniform, was back in his element, meticulously checking every control, every gauge, every dial in the cockpit. His co-pilot, Daniel, glanced over with a friendly nod as Marcus joined him in final preparations for the cross-country flight. Marcus's mind, however, was still restless, the encounter with Officer Derek Thompson lingering like an aftertaste of bitterness that he couldn't shake off. "Everything good, Captain?" Daniel asked, sensing the tension in Marcus's demeanor. Marcus managed a nod. "Just a bit of turbulence on the ground," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. He'd learned long ago to compartmentalize these moments, to push aside whatever frustrations he felt and focus on the job at hand. This cockpit was his sanctuary, a place where he was in control, where his skill and knowledge commanded respect without question. Just as they were about to go over the final checks, a knock sounded at the cockpit door. Daniel looked over, raising an eyebrow as he glanced at Marcus. "Who's that?" Daniel murmured. It wasn't typical for anyone to interrupt at this stage unless something urgent had come up. Marcus opened the door slightly, and his stomach tightened when he saw Derek standing there, still in his security uniform, his posture rigid and his face unreadable. For a split second, they simply stared at each other, the silence thick and charged with unspoken words. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Derek gave a short, stiff nod. "Just doing my job," he replied curtly, his eyes flicking past Marcus to survey the cockpit, as if checking for any signs of a breach. "I need to verify some information," he added, his tone professional yet laced with a barely concealed skepticism. Marcus felt the simmer of frustration return, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. "I've already shown you my credentials, officer." I'm the captain of this flight. Everything has been cleared through the airline and TSA. Derek didn't back down. I'm aware of that, he replied, his voice calm but unyielding. But as airport security, it's within my authority to conduct a last-minute security check if I see fit. Just making sure everything's in order. Daniel, watching from his seat, glanced between the two men with a frown. Is there an issue here? He asked, his voice cautious but tinged with disbelief. He knew Marcus well and respected him as a captain, and he was clearly perplexed by the presence of a security officer questioning Marcus's authority. Derek's eyes narrowed as he took in Daniel's questioning look. No issue, sir. I'm simply following protocol, he replied before redirecting his attention to Marcus. So, if you wouldn't mind stepping out for just a moment, Captain Carter, I'd like to go over a few details. Marcus hesitated, feeling the indignity of the request. This was his flight, his responsibility, and now he was being asked to step away from his post, as though he were a suspect instead of the pilot. But with passengers boarding and time ticking, he couldn't afford a confrontation. Fine, he replied tightly, stepping out of the cockpit and closing the door behind him. They moved a few feet down the narrow corridor, away from the ears of curious passengers. Derek crossed his arms, his gaze piercing. Just a quick question, Captain. How did you get this job? Marcus held his stare, his voice calm but edged with steel. The same way anyone else does. I trained, I studied, I worked hard, and I earned it. Derek scoffed, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Yeah. Must have been real easy for you, huh? Working with all the special treatment and programs they've got nowadays. Marcus's jaw clenched. He could feel the anger building, but he knew better than to let it show. Special treatment, he echoed, his voice dangerously calm. I've worked twice as hard as most people to get to this point, and I didn't do it to prove anything to anyone but myself. Derek chuckled humorlessly, a trace of derision in his tone. Sure. But you know, some of us don't get those kinds of breaks. Some of us have to earn our way without the benefits of being a minority. The words hit like a slap, each one laced with a kind of venom that Marcus knew all too well. He could feel the tension in his body, the years of enduring these subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, jabs boiling to the surface. But he steadied himself, keeping his tone level. With all due respect, officer, I suggest you do your job and let me do mine. This flight has hundreds of people relying on us to get them safely to Los Angeles, and I intend to do exactly that. For a moment, they locked eyes, neither willing to back down, the air between them thick with resentment and unspoken accusations. But eventually, Derek relented, stepping back with a curt nod. Fine, he muttered. You do your job. Just don't forget, people are watching. As Derek turned to leave, Marcus stood there for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides, the encounter replaying in his mind. It wasn't just Derek's words, it was the implication, the constant insinuation that he didn't belong here, that he hadn't earned his place. He took a deep breath, pushing down the frustration, reminding himself that he was here to do a job, that he had people depending on him. Returning to the cockpit, Marcus found Daniel looking at him with a concerned expression. What was that about? He asked quietly, a hint of anger in his voice. Nothing worth discussing, Marcus replied, keeping his tone steady. Let's focus on the flight. Daniel didn't press further, though Marcus could tell he was holding back. They went over the last of the checks in silence, the steady rhythm of their routine a balm to the tension that lingered in the air. But as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of his encounter with Derek. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of reprieve, focusing on the familiar controls beneath his hands. Here, in the cockpit, he was in control. Here, he was respected. Here, he was simply Captain Carter, not a man constantly questioned for his right to be where he was. But as they leveled out at cruising altitude, a soft chime indicated that the seatbelt sign was off, and Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. He wasn't going to let anyone, not Derek, not anyone, undermine his authority or his sense of self. He'd spent his whole life proving that he belonged, and he wasn't about to stop now. Daniel glanced over, sensing the shift in Marcus's mood. "You all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Marcus nodded, allowing a small, resolute smile to surface. "Yeah. I am." They exchanged a look, an understanding passing between them that didn't need words. Daniel had seen enough to understand that Marcus's journey had been anything but easy, and he respected the quiet strength that defined his captain. For the next few hours, the flight continued smoothly, the hum of the engines and the distant murmur of passengers a comforting background. Marcus felt himself relax, slipping into the rhythm of the flight, the skies steady and calm around them. But his mind occasionally drifted back to the encounter with Derek, to the feeling of being watched, judged, scrutinized, no matter how high he climbed. And then, somewhere over the Midwest, a slight shudder rippled through the plane. Marcus's hands instinctively went to the controls, his gaze sharp as he checked the instruments. It wasn't anything serious, just a minor adjustment, but it brought him back to the present, reminding him of the responsibility he carried, the lives entrusted to his care. As they neared the end of the flight, Marcus felt a sense of anticipation building. The encounter with Derek had left something unresolved, an open-ended question that hung in the air. He didn't know exactly how or when, but he knew there would be a moment, a reckoning, that would settle things once and for all. As they began their descent, Marcus glanced at Daniel, a determined glint in his eyes. "Let's make this landing one to remember," he said, his voice steady, a quiet determination underlying his words. Daniel gave a small nod, a hint of admiration in his gaze. "You've got this, Captain." With each second that passed, Marcus felt the anticipation mounting, the tension coiling tighter, preparing for something that lay just beyond the horizon. He didn't know what awaited him after the landing, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Derek Thompson, take away the pride and honor he felt in his role. The tables were about to turn, and when they did, Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. As the plane touched down smoothly at Los Angeles International Airport, the usual clatter of overhead compartments opening and seatbelts clicking filled the cabin. Passengers were gathering their belongings, a few already standing in the aisle, eager to disembark after the cross-country journey. In the cockpit, Marcus Carter allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction. The flight had gone flawlessly, and he'd delivered hundreds of passengers safely to their destination, just as he'd set out to do. "Nice landing, Captain," Daniel remarked with a grin, breaking the brief silence as they began powering down the systems. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, giving his co-pilot a quick, appreciative look. He could sense that Daniel understood, maybe even felt a bit of what Marcus carried beneath the surface, a constant need to prove, to demonstrate, to rise above. It was a shared, silent respect, one that didn't need words to be understood. Just as they finished the shutdown procedures, a voice crackled over the intercom. It was one of the flight attendants, her tone tentative, hesitant, as if unsure how to phrase what she was about to say. "Captain Carter, airport security has requested your presence at the gate, immediately." Daniel's eyes met Marcus's, a flicker of worry crossing his face. "Security?" he echoed, confusion edging into his voice. "That's unusual, isn't it?" Marcus's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Yes," he replied simply, already suspecting who was behind the request. Leaving the cockpit, Marcus walked down the narrow aisle, feeling the lingering stares of passengers still shuffling to leave. As he approached the open cabin door, the figure waiting just beyond it confirmed his suspicions, Officer Derek Thompson, standing tall with an expression that was both smug and defiant. "Captain Carter," Derek greeted him, voice laced with mock formality. "Mind stepping aside for a moment?" Marcus could feel the familiar rush of frustration, the instinct to defend himself from the silent accusations in Derek's gaze. But he kept his face calm, his voice steady. "Is there an issue, Officer Thompson?" Just a routine follow-up, Derek replied, though there was nothing routine about his stance, his posture. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for this moment, as if he'd orchestrated it, relishing in his perceived control. They moved to a corner of the gate area, where a few passengers had started to notice the exchange. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a few curious glances darting their way. The tension between them felt thick, tangible, a silent battle of wills that needed no words to convey. "So, you're really the pilot," Derek began, his tone mocking. He folded his arms, his gaze sweeping over Marcus as if searching for something he could use, some flaw, some imperfection. "It's funny, because when I saw you back there, you didn't seem like, well, let's just say I wouldn't have pegged you as captain material." Marcus held Derek's gaze, his own expression unflinching. "I've been doing this job for years, Officer Thompson. You may have your opinions, but that doesn't change the facts." Derek smirked, shifting his weight slightly. "Opinions? I don't think it's an opinion to say that people should know their place. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for certain adjustments that give people like you an edge, let's put it that way." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his tone cold but controlled. "People like me? You're talking about people who work hard, who prove themselves every day, who don't rely on assumptions or prejudice." "Oh, I get it," Derek replied with a sneer. "You're one of those who thinks he can just waltz in and start calling the shots because, what? You worked hard. You're so eager to pull the hard work card, but you don't get that there are real protocols, real standards, and that some people just don't measure up." The crowd around them had grown, passengers now openly watching the exchange. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the curiosity, but he kept his gaze fixed on Derek, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of backing down. "And you're saying I don't measure up?" Marcus challenged, his voice even but his words razor-sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, I'm the one in uniform. I'm the one who just safely landed a plane full of people while you're the one standing here, questioning my right to be here." Derek's smirk faltered for a split second, the slightest hint of uncertainty flashing across his face. But he quickly recovered, his expression hardening as he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Listen to me," he hissed, the calm veneer slipping. "You might think you belong up there, but as far as I'm concerned, this whole act you're putting on. It's just that, an act. Sooner or later, people are going to see through it, and you'll be right back where you belong." Marcus's patience snapped, the simmering anger finally reaching a boiling point. He took a step forward, his voice just as low but laced with an unmistakable edge. "And where exactly is that, Officer Thompson? Because I'm not going anywhere. I'm here because I earned it, because I've worked harder than you can even imagine. So if you want to talk about places, maybe it's time you start looking at your own." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air, a challenge that dared Derek to keep pushing. For a moment, Derek looked at him, something shifting in his gaze, a flicker of something that looked almost like doubt. But just as quickly, he masked it, his smirk returning, though it seemed weaker, less assured. "You know," Derek began, his tone softer but no less condescending, "I think you're a little too comfortable up there, Captain. Maybe it's time someone reminded you that you're not invincible." At that moment, a voice cut through the tension, a young woman, one of the passengers who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes and growing indignation. "Excuse me, but I think that's enough," she said, her voice strong and unyielding. She stepped forward, looking directly at Derek. "I saw what happened back there, and I think it's pretty clear that you're the one who's out of line." Derek turned, his expression flashing with irritation. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am." The woman didn't back down. "Actually, it does. As a passenger, I have every right to speak up when I see someone being treated unfairly. And Captain Carter here is one of the best pilots I've ever flown with. The fact that you're standing here questioning his credentials is not only unprofessional, it's insulting." Marcus glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude passing through his eyes. More passengers began to murmur in agreement, a ripple of support building among the crowd as they voiced their disapproval of Derek's behavior. Derek's face flushed, his control over the situation slipping as he realized he was losing the crowd. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl as he looked around, trying to regain the authority he thought he held. But the tide had turned. Another passenger, an older man with a firm, authoritative voice, spoke up. "Officer, maybe it's time you let Captain Carter get back to his duties. He's done nothing wrong here, and your behavior is out of line." Derek glanced around, his eyes narrowing as he realized that he was no longer in control. He was surrounded by people who had witnessed his prejudice, his blatant disrespect, and he could feel the judgment in their eyes. Without another word, he turned back to Marcus, his expression twisted with frustration and humiliation. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but edged with finality. "Looks like people are seeing through your act, Officer Thompson," Marcus said softly, his words cutting through the silence. "Maybe it's time you start proving yourself instead of questioning everyone else." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Derek's face flushed a deeper red as he realized the tables had fully turned. With one last glare, he turned and stalked away, his shoulders tense, his posture rigid as he disappeared into the terminal. Marcus watched him go, the weight of the moment settling over him as he felt a sense of closure, a finality to the encounter that left him feeling strangely at peace. The passengers around him offered nods of support, a few murmuring words of gratitude and respect as they filed past, one by one. Daniel, who had watched the entire exchange from a distance, approached, a look of admiration in his eyes. "Well handled, Captain," he said quietly, his voice filled with respect. Marcus gave a small nod, his expression calm but resolute. "Sometimes you just have to let people show their true colors," he replied, the weight of the experience settling over him as he glanced around, feeling the support and understanding of those around him. As the terminal slowly cleared, Marcus felt a quiet sense of victory, a feeling that went beyond the flight or his job. It was the victory of standing his ground, of refusing to be diminished, of knowing that respect had to be earned, and that he had done just that. As the passengers trickled out of the terminal, Marcus felt the remnants of tension slowly ebbing away. But he knew it wasn't over yet. Derek Thompson might have walked away humiliated, but Marcus could feel the weight of unspoken words still hanging in the air, unfinished business that refused to be swept aside so easily. Daniel approached, a look of support etched into his expression, but there was also a question in his eyes. "Marcus, are you all right?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy with concern. Marcus nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I'm fine, Daniel. Just, tired of always having to prove myself, you know." Daniel nodded in understanding, his gaze unwavering. "Yeah, I get it. But you didn't have to face that alone, Marcus. People are behind you. You saw the way those passengers spoke up. That's not something you see every day." A small, appreciative smile flickered across Marcus's face. "I know, and I'm grateful. But it shouldn't have to be this way," he replied, his voice barely more than a murmur. "Sometimes I just wish that respect didn't have to be fought for." They both fell silent, the weight of those words settling over them, mingling with the quiet hum of the terminal. Just as Marcus was about to suggest heading back to wrap up the post-flight paperwork, he caught sight of a familiar figure approaching from across the terminal. Derek Thompson was walking toward them, his posture tense, his face a mix of emotions, anger, shame, something else Marcus couldn't quite decipher. Daniel stepped back slightly, glancing between Marcus and Derek, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "Marcus, do you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, it's all right, Daniel. I think I need to handle this myself." With a reluctant nod, Daniel gave Marcus a reassuring pat on the shoulder before stepping away, leaving Marcus alone to face Derek. When Derek reached him, he hesitated, his eyes flickering to the ground for a brief moment before meeting Marcus's gaze. For a long, charged second, they stood in silence, the echoes of their previous exchange lingering between them. Finally, Derek cleared his throat, his voice low, almost guarded. "Captain Carter. I think we need to talk." Marcus didn't break his gaze, keeping his expression calm but unreadable. "All right. I'm listening." Derek shifted uncomfortably, his face a complex blend of emotions that seemed to struggle against each other. "Look, I know I came on too strong back there. But I've seen things, Captain. People pretending to be who they're not, trying to get access to places they don't belong. It's my job to make sure people follow the rules." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you think that justifies what you did? The way you treated me?" His voice was calm but firm, his words carrying a weight that made Derek flinch slightly. "I was doing my job," Derek replied, though his tone lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "I'm sure you can understand that, right? You're a captain. You know what it's like to have a responsibility, to make sure things run smoothly." Marcus shook his head slowly, his expression unwavering. "Doing your job doesn't mean you get to treat people like they're beneath you. It doesn't mean you get to judge someone just because of your assumptions." Derek looked down, his jaw tightening. Maybe I crossed a line. But you don't understand what it's like to always be the one making sure people are safe, to always be on guard." Marcus felt a surge of frustration rise within him, his voice tinged with a quiet intensity. "Don't tell me I don't understand, Derek. I understand all too well what it's like to be on guard, to always be second-guessed, to work twice as hard for half the respect. I understand it every day of my life." Derek looked up, his face registering the weight of Marcus's words. For the first time, a flicker of understanding passed over his features, as if he were finally seeing Marcus in a way he hadn't before. "Look," Derek murmured, his voice softer now, hesitant. I just didn't expect. I mean, when I saw you, I thought, what?" Marcus interjected, his voice laced with a hard edge. "You thought I didn't belong here? That I couldn't be a captain?" Derek looked away, unable to hold Marcus's gaze. I guess I made an assumption," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Maybe I let my guard down and I saw something that wasn't there." Marcus took a slow, steadying breath, the anger and frustration he'd held on to beginning to shift, to morph into something deeper, something that touched a place he didn't often allow himself to access. "And do you know what that assumption cost you, Derek? It cost you respect. It cost you the dignity you thought you were protecting." Derek winced, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You're right. I've been doing this job a long time, and somewhere along the line, I guess I forgot what respect really means." There was a beat of silence, a moment heavy with unspoken truths. Marcus watched Derek, gauging the sincerity in his words, the glimmer of humility that had finally broken through the layers of pride and prejudice. "Respect isn't given by a uniform or a badge, Derek," Marcus said quietly, his voice laced with a hint of sorrow. "It's earned. And it's earned by treating people with decency, no matter who they are, no matter what assumptions you carry." Derek nodded slowly, his face reflecting a mixture of regret and a dawning realization. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I just wanted to let you know that I was wrong." Marcus studied him for a long moment, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of what Derek was finally admitting. And in that moment, he felt the simmering anger, the frustration, begin to ease. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, a beginning. "I don't need an apology, Derek," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I need you to understand that people are more than the assumptions you make about them. I need you to understand that respect goes both ways." Derek nodded again, swallowing hard, his voice thick with the emotions he was struggling to control. "Thank you, Captain Carter. I'll remember that." They stood in silence for a few moments, the echoes of their exchange lingering in the air, a fragile truce forged from the embers of resentment and understanding. And though it didn't erase what had happened, it left a space for something new, something that might, one day, resemble respect. Without another word, Derek turned and walked away, his posture no longer rigid with pride but softened by a quiet, hesitant humility. Marcus watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over him. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't vindication, it was something more profound, more human. As he turned back to the terminal, Marcus felt the eyes of a few lingering passengers on him, the quiet admiration and support in their expressions unmistakable. He nodded to them, offering a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of their presence, their solidarity. Daniel approached once more, a look of quiet understanding in his eyes. "Everything all right?" Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Yeah, Daniel. Everything's all right." They walked together through the terminal, a silence between them that felt comfortable, filled not with words but with a shared understanding. Marcus knew that this encounter, this experience, would stay with him, a reminder of the quiet strength he'd built over years of navigating a world that often questioned his worth. And as they moved toward the exit, Marcus felt the weight of the day begin to lift, replaced by a newfound resolve, a determination not only to continue proving himself but to redefine what respect and dignity truly meant, both for himself and for those who doubted him. It wasn't about vengeance or pride, it was about holding his ground, about standing tall in the face of adversity and knowing, deep within himself, that he had nothing to prove, nothing to justify. Because he belonged, right there, in that cockpit, among the clouds, where respect wasn't demanded but earned, flight by flight, one steady mile at a time. The atmosphere at Los Angeles International was heavy with the ripple effects of the confrontation between Marcus and Derek. Passengers who'd witnessed the exchange were murmuring among themselves, recounting the scene with a mixture of disbelief and admiration for how Marcus had handled the situation. The weight of it lingered, an almost tangible presence, and it seemed to follow Marcus as he made his way through the airport with Daniel by his side. Daniel stole a glance at Marcus as they walked, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Marcus," he began, breaking the silence carefully, "not many people would have handled it the way you did. It was measured. Controlled." Marcus offered a slight nod, though his gaze remained distant, thoughtful. "I don't know if it was control as much as necessity," he replied. "I've had a lifetime to learn how to keep my anger in check, to find ways to respond without lashing out." He paused, taking a steadying breath. "But sometimes, Daniel, it feels like a burden to always be the bigger person, to constantly prove that I deserve respect without demanding it." Daniel's eyes softened with sympathy. "I can't imagine how exhausting that must be. And the worst part is, no matter how well you handle it, people like Derek, they still question you." Marcus nodded, a faint, rueful smile playing on his lips. "Exactly. It's like there's no winning, no final moment of, yes, I belong here, and you're going to accept it." He glanced at Daniel, his expression somber. "And sometimes I wonder, what if I did demand respect? What if, just once, I didn't hold back?" The thought lingered between them, an unspoken possibility hanging in the air. It wasn't a fantasy of vengeance or retaliation, but a quiet desire to live without the constant weight of expectation, of always being the one to set an example. Would it be so wrong? Marcus murmured, almost to himself. Would it be so wrong to let people see what it feels like to be questioned, to have to prove yourself over and over? Daniel looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it wouldn't be wrong, Marcus. Maybe it would be human." The words resonated, and Marcus felt a strange sense of comfort in them. He wasn't alone in this, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge that his restraint, his constant adherence to composure, was a form of burden, one that he carried not just for himself, but for everyone who might follow in his footsteps. As they approached the terminal's exit, the airport's public relations officer, a woman named Karen Riley, approached them, her face a mixture of concern and professionalism. Captain Carter, she greeted him with a respectful nod. I just wanted to check in with you. We received reports of the incident back at the gate, and, well, I wanted to personally express my apologies for what happened. Marcus acknowledged her with a nod, his face impassive but polite. Thank you, Ms. Riley. I appreciate that. Karen hesitated, glancing at the people bustling around them. It's not every day we have a situation like this, she said quietly. And I wanted to ask if there's anything you'd like us to address publicly. The passengers who saw the exchange, they've been talking about it, and it's likely to spread beyond the airport. I think it's only fair that your side is represented. Marcus felt a rush of mixed emotions, pride, frustration, but also a strange sense of vindication. He could share his experience, speak openly about the constant challenges he faced, the scrutiny, the disrespect. But was that what he wanted? What's your goal in asking, Ms. Riley? He asked, his voice calm but direct. Is it to protect the airport's image? Or are you genuinely interested in addressing what happened here? Karen's eyes widened slightly, taken aback, but she quickly collected herself. Both, if I'm being honest, she replied carefully. There's a lot at stake here, your reputation, the airport's reputation, and the trust passengers place in us to treat everyone with respect. Marcus considered her words, aware that his response would have consequences. Speaking out could bring attention to issues he'd quietly endured for years, but it could also paint a target on him, making him a symbol rather than a person. And yet, there was a part of him that wanted to take that chance, to show the world what he, and so many others, endured daily. I'll think about it, he replied finally, his tone thoughtful but non-committal. But I don't want to be anyone's symbol, Ms. Riley. I just want to do my job, without being second-guessed every step of the way. She nodded, understanding his hesitance. Of course, Captain. Just know that if you decide to say something, we're here to support you. With a final nod, she excused herself, leaving Marcus and Daniel alone again. Daniel looked at him, a hint of admiration in his eyes. You could speak out, you know, he said quietly. And it would mean something. Marcus met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maybe it would. Or maybe it would just give people another reason to question me. He sighed, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. But I don't want to be remembered for an incident like this. I want to be remembered for what I do in that cockpit. They continued to walk, the conversation lingering in the air like an unfinished symphony. As they reached the staff exit, Marcus felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw an unexpected message from the airline's director of operations, asking to meet with him privately the next day. Marcus's brows knitted together in curiosity. He hadn't been expecting such a response, but perhaps news of the incident had reached higher levels than he anticipated. For a moment, he wondered what the airline's stance would be. Would they stand by him, offer their support, or would they encourage him to let it go, to maintain peace and avoid controversy? Daniel noticed his expression, raising an eyebrow. Everything all right? Marcus pocketed the phone, nodding thoughtfully. Just an unexpected meeting. I'll know more tomorrow. The next day, Marcus found himself seated in a sleek office on the top floor of the airline's headquarters, a panoramic view of the city stretching beyond the windows. The director of operations, a man named Tom Spencer, entered with a calm but serious expression, motioning for Marcus to take a seat. Captain Carter, he began, his tone professional but respectful. I appreciate you meeting with me on such short notice. I wanted to personally address the incident from yesterday. Marcus nodded, his face impassive. Of course, Mr. Spencer. I'm here to listen. Tom settled into his chair, folding his hands on the desk as he leaned slightly forward. First, let me say that I've heard nothing but positive feedback about your conduct. The passengers who witnessed the exchange were impressed by your professionalism. And, as a company, we value how you handled it. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, unsure of where this was leading. Thank you, sir. Tom's expression grew more serious, his gaze piercing. However, there's more to consider. Incidents like this, well, they attract attention. We live in a time where public perception can impact an airline's image overnight. Marcus felt a familiar pang of frustration rising. He could sense the underlying message, the caution, the hesitation to address what had really happened. So what are you saying? Marcus asked, keeping his tone even. Tom hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. I'm saying that we support you, but we'd appreciate it if you could approach this with discretion. If you choose to address the situation, we'd encourage you to keep it focused on professionalism and respect, rather than specific accusations. Marcus's eyes narrowed, a surge of indignation building within him. In other words, avoid making it about race. Tom's expression softened, his tone almost regretful. It's not that we're denying what happened. But as an organization, we have to balance how we address these things. Sometimes, speaking too openly can attract backlash, both for the individual and for the company. Marcus felt the weight of the unspoken expectations pressing down on him once more. Be professional, stay quiet, don't make it personal. But how could he separate himself from what had happened? It wasn't just about professionalism, it was about being seen, about being respected without needing to mute parts of himself to fit into an image of neutrality. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he met Tom's eyes. Mr. Spencer, with all due respect, I've spent my entire career proving that I'm more than someone's assumption, more than just a box to be checked. And while I understand the airline's perspective, I won't compromise my integrity to maintain a sanitized image. Tom looked at him, a flicker of respect breaking through his cautious expression. I understand, Captain Carter. And whatever decision you make, we'll support you. I just wanted you to be aware of the potential consequences. Marcus gave a nod, standing from his chair. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Spencer. I appreciate it. As he left the office, Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that by speaking out, he'd be drawing attention, both positive and negative. But he also felt a deep certainty that it was time to take a stand, to show that he wasn't just a pilot defined by his professionalism, but a person whose experiences, whose identity, deserved respect. In the days that followed, news of the incident circulated through the industry, sparking discussions and debates about respect, equality, and the challenges faced by professionals who were often second-guessed simply because of who they were. Some supported Marcus openly, expressing admiration for his resilience and calling for change. Others remained silent, perhaps uncomfortable with the realities his story had uncovered. But as Marcus continued to fly, to command each plane with the same precision and confidence he always had, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to keep flying, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been made to feel that they didn't belong. As the weeks passed, the incident at the airport transformed from a fleeting experience into a conversation that extended far beyond Marcus's daily life. Passengers, colleagues, and even those outside the aviation industry reached out, sharing stories of their own, offering support, and encouraging him to continue standing up for what he believed in. Marcus found himself at the center of a dialogue he hadn't sought, but one that felt essential, meaningful, and long overdue. The airline, after observing the impact of Marcus's story, issued a public statement acknowledging the need for deeper respect and empathy within their workforce. They implemented an inclusivity training program aimed at fostering respect, not only for employees but for every person who passed through their doors. Marcus was offered the opportunity to contribute to the program, to be a voice of change, to share his experiences with new employees, ensuring that the lessons learned from his encounter would resonate for years to come. And then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived, a formal apology from Officer Derek Thompson. The words were written with a humility Marcus hadn't expected, and as he read, he felt the weight of Derek's acknowledgement. I understand now that respect is not something to be wielded like a weapon, but to be given freely, without assumptions. I judged you without knowing you, and that was wrong. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, and I hope to be better, to approach people with the decency and respect they deserve. Derek's letter was not an erasure of what had happened, nor did it diminish the hurt it had caused. But it was a beginning, a small step toward understanding, and in that gesture, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: growth. Derek was reassigned to a different role within airport security, one focused on community engagement, where he would interact with travelers on a personal level, fostering trust rather than suspicion. It was a role designed to teach him humility and empathy, to challenge the very biases that had clouded his judgment before. For Marcus, life moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose. He continued flying, each flight a reminder of the resilience he had cultivated over the years. But now, he carried with him a new responsibility, not just as a captain, but as a mentor and a symbol of change. He took on the role with humility, using his platform to uplift others and advocate for the respect that every professional, every human, deserved. The airline's inclusivity program grew, with Marcus playing an active role. His story became a part of the orientation for new employees, reminder that true respect was rooted in empathy and understanding. He worked closely with staff from all departments, breaking down barriers and encouraging open conversations. It was a long journey, one that required patience, but Marcus found fulfillment in knowing that his efforts were making a difference. One day, as he prepared for another cross-country flight, a young pilot approached him, his eyes filled with admiration. "Captain Carter, I just wanted to say thank you," the young man began, his voice sincere. "I've heard your story, and it's inspiring to know that someone like you has paved the way for people like me. It's not easy, but knowing that you stood up, that you demanded respect, it makes me believe that I can, too." Marcus smiled, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone," he replied gently. "Remember that you're here because you belong, because you earned it. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." As he took his seat in the cockpit, Marcus felt a quiet pride. The journey hadn't been easy, and he knew it would continue, but he was no longer alone. He had planted seeds of change, and he could see them beginning to grow, shaping a future where respect wasn't conditional but intrinsic. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Marcus felt a surge of peace, a sense of closure that finally settled over him. He had reclaimed his dignity, not through retaliation, but through resilience, by standing tall in the face of doubt and holding true to his values. He had won, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that mattered more deeply, more profoundly. He had become a part of something bigger than himself, a force for change in an industry, a voice for those who had long been silent. As for Derek, he would continue to learn, his path forever altered by the encounter that had forced him to confront his own biases. In his new role, he faced the challenge of rebuilding trust, both with himself and the people he served. It was a difficult road, but one that offered him the chance to grow, to become the person he had once pretended to be, a protector, a guide, and, perhaps one day, a friend to those he once judged too quickly. And in the quiet spaces between flights, Marcus found himself filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the journey that had brought him here, for the resilience that had sustained him, and for the community of voices that had supported him along the way. His story was no longer just his own, it was a part of a larger movement, a call for respect, for empathy, for a world where people were seen not for the assumptions placed upon them, but for who they truly were. In the end, this story is about more than just Marcus and Derek. It's about the universal struggle for respect, for dignity, and the courage it takes to stand up when the world seems to question your worth. It's a reminder that resilience isn't about suppressing anger or ignoring hurt, it's about using those experiences to create change, to demand a world where every individual, regardless of their background, is treated with the respect they deserve. So, what do you think? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to stand up for respect? How did you handle it, and what impact did it have on you? We'd love to hear your stories and reflections in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this powerful journey. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and turn expectations upside down.